We are live. Welcome, everybody. And I have my cat, Archimedes, who I'm probably going to play this game with him a lot in terms of him jumping onto my lap and then moving him to the floor. He's probably just going to go right around and jump back on. But I may just end up leaving him on my lap and try to not be too distracted by a very determined cat. Here he comes. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us here. And this is pretty cool. I've never done the Zoom meets YouTube live situation, so I think this will be fun. It's going to be hopefully informative. Obviously, that's my intent anyway. The irony with the title, and I'll go into a little bit of a description of who I am and what the ISA is and all that stuff. But the irony with the title of this particular lecture is that there's the words must have in the title. Crucial characteristics your script must have. And I just always want to put a disclaimer out there that there are rules, of course, in the world of screenwriting, but you don't feel bound by them, as if, oh no, I don't have this particular exact beat structure, or by this page this particular thing didn't happen. There are ways to move around these rules a little bit. I think the primary thing to remember is that as long as you know the rules, then you can start bending them, maybe break them a little bit. I think A Quiet Place is a really great example of a script that broke a lot of typical screenwriting formatting rules. But there has to be a very specific reason why the rules are broken. Now, I'm not going to go into all of the rules. There are a lot of so-called rules. I'm just going to go into some specifics in terms of three characteristics that I think a script should have in order for you to get noticed. Because I think also we have to come from a place of intent here. What's my purpose with this particular screenplay that I'm working on, and or every screenplay that I'm working on. Our first intent, and this is just my advice, not necessarily something that I am trying to throw on you as a must-have, is that we really should just come from a place of, I'm trying to tell a story, and I want people to be affected by it in one way or another, regardless of genre. That's really all we can try to do. If we start going to a place where it's like, I want to try to make money doing this, or I want to become a star, I want to win an Academy Award, you start going off on routes that aren't as true to who we are as we could be. So we just want to, kind of ground ourselves there. And I'll probably be putting some disclaimers throughout all of my descriptions here in terms of what these little characteristics are. Anyway, just to kind of back up a little bit, again, thank you for having me here. I am honored to be the only male in this very cool media summit that's being put on here. Honestly, I mean that. I think it's special to be included here. So I'm going to do my best to inform everybody as best I can from my own experience as an educator, and that's my first role in terms of what I do with the International Screenwriters Association. I wear a lot of hats, much less the hat of cat owner. But this is Archimedes, by the way. If you were interested in knowing his name. Anyway, my title at the International Screenwriters Association is Director of Education. And it sounds pretty straightforward. My focus is on making sure writers stay as educated as they possibly can. And we have a whole bunch of functions on the website that can help you do that, from the new ISA Insider, which is primarily a news source, but there are also a whole bunch of different podcasts that are available there. Event notices, a lot of the events I host in terms of what we do with the ISA as far as bringing panelists on, a lot like what the Media Summit here is doing. We try to do them on a relatively smaller scale, but on a more regular basis. And we have, Friday events called ISA Presents. And then we have a third Thursdays event where we bring in, sometimes pitch panels. I do a monthly class for our Connect members. So the members that are paying $10 a month, they get a class every month. Plus, I created coursework that we're going to be integrating into the ISA website. You can go to thecraftcourse.com if you wanted to just take a look. And then I'm also a story consultant with my own production consulting company called The Story Farm. And I work one-on-one with writers as an executive would a development consultant would, helping with brainstorming and obviously development. But I try to kind of take this 50-50 approach in my consulting where I'm explaining the notes. Like, here's why I felt this particular way at this particular spot in the script. And it's rarely just for reasons of structure. And this is kind of one of the things I'm going to talk about. But anyway, I don't want to go off in too much of a tangent there. But yeah, I'm a story consultant, director of education with the ISA. If you don't know what the ISA is, you should go to networkisa.org and you can sign up for a membership for free. A lot of bonuses that you get as a member, even on the free level. But the Connect membership gives you a lot more above that. So just check it out. We have a lot of events. And one of the positives that has come out of this pandemic is that we are able to do these Zoom events and we get people from everywhere. And, usually the events for the industry anyway, or at least industry involved events were live prior to the pandemic. And we had to use the recording to allow people who weren't in Los Angeles to be able to take part. But now we're able to share these events and everybody can take part. So I think it's a very cool thing. And it's one of those things that we're going to keep doing regardless, however long this pandemic lasts, we're going to keep doing this so everybody, can learn something. And that's my main focus, is to make sure that everybody learns something from interacting with me, regardless of where we go, what I'm doing, whether I'm on Zoom or live or teaching classes or going one-on-one. And he has not learned that this is annoying. Anyway, so let's do this. So in terms of questions, you can ask questions at any time, and Patrice is going to be able to send them over and put them in the little chat box here so I can see them. And they can be about anything, if you have questions about screenplay contests, which the ISA has a lot of, or, how do I get a manager? It can be anything, because I don't only work in the world of education. I'm also a screenwriter and writer myself. And typical feline is one of the, the comments. He is a little above typical, but anyway, I am also the co-VP of development for our production and development company called Creative Screenwriter, where we have a slate of projects that we're taking out to town. We have agency representation. So we have our agent who's helping us, open doors and take pitch meetings. And we've taken plenty of those even during the pandemic. So I do happen to know a decent amount about the industry and what's going on. So if you have industry questions, please feel free to ask. And then I also have a project that I'm taking out, an animated TV project for the 11 to 14-year-old age range, and trying to get that created into a TV series, which, a lot easier said than done, but I'm trying. So anyway, feel free to ask whatever you like. And, Patrice is going to be sending over questions. So we'll start. I'll go probably like 45 minutes to maybe an hour, depending on how much, I want to cover and not repeat myself. And then we'll open it up to just straight Q&A after that. And so we're going to talk about crucial characteristics your script must have. And like I said, there's a little bit of an irony in that, because I don't want you to feel bound by this. These are suggestions. These are things that when readers are looking at screenplays, they're hoping to see these things. Sometimes it's an unconscious hope. They're not sitting down in front of a screenplay going, I hope I see this. Some of them are conscious, but others are not. And really, it's for reason of audience expectation. And that audience, first and foremost, when you have a screenplay that's done, is the reader. We have to be speaking to the reader as much as we can, so that person who's reading the script is having an experience. Eventually it's going to make its way on screen, hopefully. And a lot can change between when it's read as a screenplay and when it ends up on the screen. And anybody who's worked in production, that even if it's a small short film, things change on the fly. You're making changes on set. The script is rarely exactly as it was when it was finished as a draft and compared to what it is on screen. So, we have to be speaking to that reader. We have to make sure that, the promise of your premise is presented, and that premise is more than just story. It's feeling and tone, emotional response, all these things need to be considered. And it leads me into that first little bullet point. I don't know if you all looked at the event description, but I had the three primary crucial characteristics being voice and originality, character progression, and logistical structure. And I'll talk about what I mean by that, of course. And then just the basic, formatting and scene writing. And we'll talk about that because it sounds so obvious. And there are plenty of things that obviously need to be included in your screenplay, like words. Yeah, we're dealing in the realm of words. We need to be using them. But obviously, I'm also kidding. But it's, going further to conflict. Like, of course, conflict needs to be included. So I'm going to be kind of, there are things that we all inherently should know as writers need to be in our script. A character probably needs to be in there. I'm going to get into some more intricate and in some ways theoretical characteristics that need to be in there. So the first one that I want to talk about, it's kind of segueing from what I was talking about as far as emotion and tone, is voice and originality. And I can't emphasize enough the need as writers and really as artists, the need to do some work on ourselves. And not because we need improvement, but that level of work where we just dive in a little bit deeper than other people who aren't in the arts. Doesn't make us any better or worse or anything, but the reason for it is because we're trying to allow audience members, or members of the audience just in general, to feel something. And we have to remember that. That's our primary purpose. We are instilling some kind of an emotion in people, which is a tall order. Really think about that. Some of us have the natural ability to do that. But it's a tall order because we have to do it through story, and the first way we're able to instill emotion into people, and this just through interacting with just anyone, off the street, on the street, is by being who we are as much as we can be. And that then means, like what I was saying, doing the work on ourselves from a deep level, like, because, consider all of the character work you do when you're developing and doing backstory and character sketches. And we do all this work on our characters so that we can eventually put those things into our screenplay. Of course, why aren't we doing that for ourselves? Because I think I have Archimedes hair in my eye. We need to be doing that for ourselves because that then translates to really every corner of our story, whether it's a half-hour sitcom, to an hour-long drama, to a feature-length epic, whatever you're writing, ourselves needs to be infused into that. And so that's this term that we hear all the time, voice. And it's a difficult term to knock down and define because everybody kind of thinks of it differently. But I think the easiest way to consider what voice means is your perspective on a particular subject, because that then allows you to see and understand that I have a unique take on the same subject that someone else may also consider. And I if anybody has watched any other panels or classes that I've hosted, you've probably heard me use this example, but imagine if Judd Apatow directed and made a remake of Friday the 13th. It would probably be quite a bit different than what we know of Friday the 13th. And because he's always coming from a place of knowing himself, like, this is how I want to tell a story, regardless of what kind of story it is. I mean, granted, he probably wouldn't remake Friday the 13th, but nonetheless, if he did, that it would probably be comedic with some level of heart, but still be, true to the original content. And so his take on virtually any subject is a comedic one, but from, a level of reality. And Jerry Seinfeld's a great example. He's always commenting on pretty mundane things. And we have to be coming from that place of what is my personal take on this subject? Because if you're sitting right next to somebody else, that other person might be looking at the same exact thing, but their take is different. And I think a good example of that comes from an interview that I did on a podcast. And the two people I had on were these two guys that were writers on the show Bob's Burgers, and both really funny guys. And I asked them this question: what does voice mean? And one of them said, a good example is, and this is his words, he said, I grew up with a twin, or I have a twin. And we basically experienced the same exact childhood. Everything we did together, and yet, their parents, his parents, fought all the time. Nothing, thankfully to a level of abuse or anything, but they were just constantly fighting and bickering, and it was just kind of, over the top. And the gentleman I had on the podcast said, I looked at it in just kind of this ridiculous way. I had to make fun of it, and take a comedic approach in terms of perspective. Otherwise, it would have just been too effective. But my brother took it very harshly, and the same exact experience they both had. One of them took it comedically, the other took it dramatically, and it affected him in a much different way. So it's a good example of, again, what's my take on this? What do I have to say about it? What do I hope other people see by way of my take on it? Because someone else might be able to write the same story, but just in a different way. And it's important for us to be able to define that. How, where did my perspective come from? What happened to me in my past that helped shape my perspective? And an example I use in the coursework I have is, I have my writers go through, really the only form of journaling I have them go through is just a couple little exercises called voice pressure points. And all it is just looking back through your life at points where, either positive or negative, that changed your outlook and perspective on the world around you. Something happened. Maybe it was one literal moment that just totally opened your mind, or it was a series of moments over a certain amount of time, that you learned something that changed how you approach the world. And we all have those moments. I mean, it might have happened yesterday. Our voice is evolving. But for me, the example I use in my coursework is that I was 11 years old. I'll try to keep the story relatively short, because if you've seen me give these panels before, you probably heard this. But I was 11 years old. I grew up in Wisconsin. I'm in Wisconsin right now, at least during the pandemic. I usually live in LA. But I was a huge Cubs fan, baseball Cubs fan growing up, and they were terrible. Always. But I was out in the back porch with my dad and his brother, my uncle. They were watching the Cubs game, and I had, my glove and ball, and, as a kid, and I loved baseball so much. And I was actually pretty good at it. So I had reason to think, okay, this is something I'm going to do for a long time. And my uncle asked me the typical question, Max, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I remember thinking, and I just distinctly remember thinking, what a silly question. Like, what do you mean? Of course, I'm going to be the shortstop for the Cubs. Like, there was a literal zero doubt factor in my brain. And I said that to my uncle. I said, well, I'm going to be the shortstop of the Cubs. And my dad, I have a great relationship with my father, so don't read into this. But my dad has always been a realist, mainly because he is afraid of, his kids maybe going through failure. He was being overprotective, really, ultimately, in terms of his response. And he said, not with raising his voice or anything, but he said, Max, you're probably not going to be the shortstop of the Cubs. And I was always a sensitive kid, and I took it in a way where it was mind blowing. And I thought, what? Like, what do you, I didn't understand. And I didn't start crying. But I also didn't argue with him. And other people may have come at it from a place, the same exact experience of, well, then I'm going to show you. Other people may have come at it like that. I didn't. I kind of believed him. And from that point on, I started to look at the world in a different way, where even though I have dreams for something, it may not happen. Like there's a good chance that my dream isn't going to come true. And maybe that's a little bit of an exaggeration. And in no way do I blame that moment for not becoming a professional baseball player. There are other factors involved. But it hit me. And the reason I created that as a little exercise for my writers is because I noticed a few years ago that my characters in all the different stories that I was writing, whether it was the novel or screenplays or whatever, kind of had this same level of a characteristic where it was like a dangerous dreamer, or a hopeless dreamer, or romantically hopeless as opposed to hopelessly romantic. There was this level of a character who so badly wanted something, but was held back by his or her own belief system. until I created a character that was so not related to who I was. And I wrote a fantasy novel called The Wish Keeper. This is what we're developing into an animated TV series. It did pretty well, and I had a lot of fun doing it, and I'm still developing it in multiple mediums. But when I wrote that character, the main character is a 16-year-old girl, basically, but she's a 5.5-inch tall fairy with shredded wings. And I think a friend of mine asked me, like, how are you connected to that character? Because I have no experience as a 16-year-old girl, much less a fairy with, a handicap. I didn't grow up with a disability. And so I really kind of dived into that because I was like, you're right. I want to make sure that I'm as authentic as I can. And I realized that most of the brainstorming I was doing was based on, at least for the main character, was based and coming from this level of, I wish I was this character, because she was very different. She was completely determined, never took no for an answer, believed so much in her intentions and dreams that it was actually a flaw. It was the opposite of my experience that I had when I was 11. And in a way, it was my unconscious coming out saying, this is how you should have reacted, and in a little bit of a vengeful way. So anyway, I mean, I could go on and on about, the development of that, but we have to be doing that work on ourselves, because we're creating and coming up with these stories that we're writing for personal reasons that sometimes aren't obvious. We just think it's a cool idea, but there's something else connecting us to the reason behind writing it. And we have to do that work on ourselves in order to understand how we're going to connect to the characters that are going to be, relaying this story, because that then relates back to this term of audience expectation. The audience expects to be feeling something when they're watching this. And the primary way to do that, which gets into a little bit of my second point of character progression, is through character. We've all heard that before, but we have to be aware of that. But our characters are pieces of ourselves. And if we haven't done enough work on ourselves and to understand, in order to understand who we are, what are our own flaws, what's my voice, what's my perspective, then we're not going to be able to infuse that into our own characters as well as we could. And there's a really important note in that, and it's not necessarily listed in my 3 characteristics, but one little rule that we have to remind ourselves is that we can't always accept the first version of an idea. And that idea doesn't necessarily need to be story, but the first version of a scene, or the first version of a character brainstorm, the first version of an act. The first version of any idea is hopefully good, but it's probably not the best version, and that's fine. Like, that's why we go through multiple drafts of a script. We have to pull out the very best of all of these moments. So anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent, but so that's a lot of what voice means in terms of how to use it and as a development tool. Not just here's me and here's what it, okay, cool, I did that work. You have to know how to use that and put it into your script, and that filters out into everything down to word choice. If you're writing a romantic comedy, what's your take on romance? How do you feel about it? Is it horrific? Is it completely ridiculous and melodramatic and sappy? Is it kind of cynical? We want to be asking those questions. Like, I like romantic comedies, but what's my version of a romantic comedy? What do I have to say about romance? What do I have to say about the ridiculousness of a relationship, or how important it is to fall in love, or whatever? We need to be doing that work. And that then speaks just naturally to that kind of second half of the first point of voice and originality, because originality is something that we all inherently have because we're all unique. But we can't just accept that at a surface level when it comes to creating material for Hollywood. We have to do the work as to, okay, well, I know I'm original because I'm me and nobody else is. But what does that mean in terms of my take on story? What do I have to say? I have a message to share. How is it different than other messages? And just let's try to find ways to make this as unique as we can, because that's ultimately our job as writers, is that we have to come up with something different. We have to come up with a different take, a new type of story, or a new take on an old story. What is the most unique element of the story I'm brainstorming? Let's speak to that as much as we can. Going back to the fairy story that I wrote, I went through probably 3 or 4 different stories, completely different stories, before I ever got to the point of making this fairy the main character. And those 3 or 4 stories that I started with had nothing to do with fairies at all. But it was in the fantasy genre. And there was this one character that kept popping up. And she just became a little bit more interesting. You know, she started off with just a little chip in her wing. And then I kept developing her because, and I'll go off on a little bit of a side note here, the best advice I think I ever got when I was starting my process as a screenwriter forever ago, was that you have to make things as difficult as possible for your main character. And so when I saw this main character, and she was becoming more interesting than the rest of the story and the rest of the characters, I pulled her out and I thought, okay, well, what can I do to make her more unique? And then in the back of my head, I'm like, I have to make things as difficult as possible for her. So I slowly, the poor thing, destroyed her wings to the point of where she couldn't fly at all. They were unusable, they were ugly, and all these things that all came from this thought of let's make things as difficult as possible for her. And through that, then a story started to take shape because of just her physical ability or inability. And now I started to see moments that popped up from a scene level, like, okay, even without a real story coming into play, just by coming from a place of let's make this as difficult as possible for her. But again, that's going to the idea of my first version of an idea not being the best version. I saw that she was the most unique element. Let's pull her out. Let's build a story around her. And then things really started to flow. Let's see. We've got another question here. How would you say the characteristics of a script have to change between feature length and short films? So in terms of voice and originality, they don't change at all. If you're writing a feature length, you still want your voice to be apparent. If you're writing a short film, it's all about voice, especially, short is really more of a director's medium than it is a screenwriter's medium, which, hopefully can change a little bit because a writer deserves to be noted, if they write a short film and somebody else directs it. But nonetheless, from a structural standpoint, obviously quite a bit different, but we still have a level of the beats are there. We see the same level of a rhythm, even in a short film compared to a feature. And I'll get into a lot of the details on that. But in terms of formatting and scene writing, which is the third level of a script must have, it needs to be formatted correctly. And I'll get into that too. And it's kind of a no-brainer. It's probably the one point that I'll spend the least amount of time on, because folks, if you're not formatting your screenplay correctly, if you're not using some level of a professional screenwriting software, people they're going to open the script and they're going to know it immediately. It's going to annoy readers if the format's all wonky, and the scene headings aren't properly formatted. All these things are really basic, and it's the easiest thing to fix. So nonetheless, if you're writing a short script, you still need the formatting to be right. Scenes still need to be powerful. So just to make sure I'm answering your question, how would you say the characteristics of a script have to change? So it's they don't have to change, I guess, is my answer. I don't know if that helps. But I don't think they have to change, at least in terms of the 3 characteristics I'm presenting here. One must have, I guess, is a level of satisfaction in some way. It should be happening by the end of any story you're writing. A level of satisfaction in a short film may end on an upbeat, meaning upbeat isn't the right way of saying it, but leaving us with questions that are satisfying, as opposed to with a feature, we're usually answering the questions. That might be one, way of changing that up. So in terms of that, term originality, it comes from voice. It comes from looking at your concept and finding out, okay, what's the most unique element? What do I think is the most different element of my story that other people haven't seen? Let's try to focus on that as much as we can, because that's ultimately what people are going to remember, not only after they're watching or they have watched your project, but when they're considering it for production or representation or whatever. I hope that helps. I mean, there are a lot of other things that I could go in there, but I don't want to spend too much time on that. But if you have any other questions, throw another one at me. And it's okay if you don't, but we'll go into the next point. So this is character progression and logistical structure. So the irony here is that there's a pretty big difference between logistical structure and character progression. Character progression is really kind of another term for structure, but in a much more ooey gooey, like unbounded way, meaning it's an emotional feeling to the rhythm of your script. And it's all through the progression of the character changing through relationships. And I'll explain that more. But logistical structure is just a very literal beat structure. So I teach a 12 sequence approach to a feature length film. There is also the 12 sequence approach to an hour-long drama or even a half-hour comedy. It's just much more condensed, and I could have a whole other class about how to approach all that. But generally speaking, there are 12 sequences in any story, almost regardless how long or short the story is. Some short films, again, you're not going to end necessarily with a climax. You're going to be ending with a question that's nuances. Regardless, I approach this feature length process in, yes, a 3-act structure, but broken up into 12 sequences. And each sequence is made up of roughly 8 to 10 pages. Not every sequence is created equal, but nonetheless, there are multiple scenes within a particular sequence. Sequence 1, 2, and 3 is your first act. Sequences 4 through 9 is your second act. Sequences 10 through 12 is your third act. It's just a way for me to organize it in my head, and it's worked pretty well. It's a way to develop and brainstorm. So taking that approach of a logistical structure, it is a must-have in terms of a level of audience expectation. The audience expects that roughly half hour into a movie, we know who our main character is, what that character wants, why the character can't have it, how difficult a particular new opportunity or a setup or inciting incident, whatever you want to call it, is going to be. We have a glimpse into what the second act might look like. We know who the other players are going to be. Other people call them secondary characters or whatever, the mentor or whatever that might be. We understand who those characters will be and the impact those characters are going to have. We've been introduced, or at least given a glimpse into the coming world. We understand what genre is. There are a whole bunch of things that the audience expects to have and know within the first half hour, roughly speaking. Don't take it literally. It's not like, every single page is exactly a minute long. It's the general old school rule. But nonetheless, your first act is probably between, 24 to 27, 8, 9, 30 pages. Again, it's not perfect. You don't have to follow the literal by this page number, this has to happen, but we do need to have the particular pieces of information presented. Same goes for a second act. We need to have during the middle, 50 pages, we need to see the character pursuing something, it being difficult, victories and failures along the way. Most important though, and that's why I put character progression first, character progression and logistical structure. But the most important element of, I would argue, any story is the relationship progression, the progression of the dynamic between at least two people. In Tom Hanks' movie Castaway, as an example, even that had a progression between him and Wilson. He's by himself the whole time, but there was at least some level of a progression of the relationship. Wilson represented something. It did kind of, go on a little bit of an evolutionary arc between the two of them, and he loses Wilson, and it was devastating because of what Wilson represented to him. So even that is a relationship progression. You see how it evolves and changes. So if there's anything you remember from a basic script must-have, is how we see a character grow and evolve and change, or not grow and evolve and change, but by way of a secondary character affecting that main character. A lot of the obvious examples come from a mentor-student type of example, like a Doc Brown and Marty, Obi-Wan and Luke. Frodo and Samwise in Lord of the Rings is a little bit of that. Samwise isn't as much of a mentor, but Sam is a perfect example of a secondary character because, especially in the third movie. I don't know if anybody's watched it, but there's a moment where Frodo says, "I don't think I can go on anymore." And Sam says, "I can't carry the ring for you, but I can carry you." And he puts Frodo on the back and he walks him up the mountain. That's the very exaggerated, typical approach of what a positive secondary character is doing for your main character, putting the main character into situations to help them achieve whatever, exterior goal they have. But by putting that character into these situations, it's changing that person. It's affecting them, and it's forcing them to face their flaw. A really obvious example is Steve Carell, who was terrified of vulnerability in 40-Year-Old Virgin. He had never had sex before. He was scared of other people finding out, who he really is, because he was very self-conscious. What happens? That he's literally placed into the most uncomfortable situations that you could come up with. Dates with rather sexually active women, so from a brainstorm level, that makes sense. We have a character who has this type of personal issue, whether we call it a problem or not. He thought it was, it was really important to him. And so he went on this adventure and trying to date and just have sex. Sadly, that's, the surface level problem. But he comes to realize that it wasn't really the sex he wanted. He wanted someone to just care about who he was, and so he had to go through this process in order to find that. And so his experiences with his coworkers, his experiences with Catherine Keener, all put him into situations that forced him to face up to these problems. Not the problem of being a virgin, but the problem of not owning up to who he was and accepting who he was. And he didn't know he needed to do that. And that's pretty much any story you see, right? The character sets off wanting something. They come around by the end, realizing they need something else. These are all exaggerated versions. Your story doesn't need to follow that exactly. Some characters just kind of change. Some characters don't change at all. Forrest Gump is pretty much the same guy by the end of that movie. But he affects other people around him. Ted Lasso. I don't know if anybody's watching this show on Apple TV Plus, and if you haven't yet, you really should. It's one of my favorite new shows. But Ted Lasso, the main character, is one of those people that he does slowly evolve through the first season, but not a lot. He stays pretty much who he is. In TV, you see that a lot more often. Either the main character doesn't change at all, or it's a very, very slow evolutionary change. In movies, you can have the same thing as long as you understand why I'm not having my character change. It's for a specific reason. It's usually because we want the characters around the main character to change instead, So anyway, that's what I mean by character progression. Yes, it's structural. By certain points, a character should be having this experience or should be, facing his or her flaw at this level. But from a logistical structure, if we look, and I'll get to these questions in a second, I see them popping up. But from a logistical level, beat by beat, by this page, that kind of approach. If you look at the movie When Harry Met Sally, which I assume most of you at least have heard of, it's one of my favorites. I use the example all the time, but that was a much different structural approach. If you really study When Harry Met Sally, that third act is maybe like 10 pages. It's really short. And they spend a very, very long time in that second act. And if you look at the midpoint complication, which is the sixth sequence, it's the midpoint twist. Everything changes. Basically, in When Harry Met Sally, it's when Harry and Sally have sex together. Rather late, in terms of a page count. And time, timestamp matter, meaning if you were to watch the movie, it's pretty late when they finally do sleep together. And the reason for that is specific to the story. Nora Ephron, who's just a genius, she knew that we wanted to spend time with Harry and Sally throughout the years so that we understood their own personal evolution outside of when they finally have some form of a relationship. And so she also knew that she needed to make that as fun as possible because the audience could grow bored if we're going to wait this long for the really big twist to occur. But it's a difficult example because at the time, that was a pretty unique romantic comedy. We hadn't really seen that story told yet, so it was new and it was different. A lot of romantic comedies are trying to, basically emulate or do the same thing, just from a tone and feeling level. But, so they were able to get away with some of that a little bit more because we hadn't quite seen that before, where we spend so much time with these characters. But it's also Billy Crystal, Rob Reiner, Meg Ryan, and Carrie Fisher. And I mean, the cast was so great. And so they were able to deliver a lot of this fun that we needed throughout the process before you get to the problem in the middle, because it's all based on this one entertaining argument, right? That's the most unique element of the story of men and women can't be friends without sex getting in the way. They bring that up almost immediately. So that then is the rest of the movie of let's prove that that's true. And then, of course, the primary complication happens when they do sleep together, and it's kind of proven, yeah, men and women can't be friends, but there's also some argument as you go of, yes, you can be friends. Anyway, we don't need to get into that, but I went off on a little bit of a tangent there, but I guess the point there is that you can mess around with the logistical structure as long as the character progression is there. As long as we see Harry and Sally changing and evolving and, coming into their own, and they're going through their own drama and conflict and things are difficult, it stays interesting. One example I'll use just from a logistical standpoint is Back to the Future, mainly because we've all seen it, and I'll hit these questions right after this. But Back to the Future is one of those movies where you start to just forget about the structure. You're not paying attention to what happens when, because if you really watch it, almost every scene has a new twist or complication. Almost literally every single scene changes the course of their story. We have to go this direction. Whoop, that just happened. We have to go that way. And it's over and over and over again. So to define what the midpoint complication is, it's kind of tough because everything's complicated. And so then it's you're not even worried about logistical structure. You're seeing the progression of the story and how interesting and fun this world they're in. And then there are little moments throughout where you see Marty kind of learning a little bit. Even in the first movie, Marty doesn't change that much, but he does have moments with his father in 1955 when his dad says something to Marty that Marty said, that moment where his dad says something like, "Oh, I don't think I could ever have anybody read my stories. What if they don't like them?" I'm not quoting that perfectly, but it was exactly what Marty had said before he went, back in time. And so there's this slight progression of learning that I'm not so different to my family than I thought I was. But everything is so fun around it with new complications every time, new problems, new conflict, that you've sucked in. Like, yeah, I'll just watch this and enjoy it. That's why character progression is so important. We see the progression of this character evolving, changing. If they're not, then they're just going in and out of these really fun moments. Anyway, I could keep going and kind of repeat myself, but let's look at the questions here. So let's see if I have all of them. Where can writers find formatting information on writing a screenplay? The first, easiest, and freest, for lack of better grammar, totally free. Just find some movies that you love, just like off the top of your head, and try to Google that movie plus PDF and see if you can find the actual real script, because sometimes you do that and you find that people just like transcribe the thing and it's like, it looks terrible. That's the easiest way to do it. Just read scripts in any way, shape, or form. See what other people have done. But in terms of really learning how the process goes, Dave Trottier's book, The Screenwriter's Bible, pretty much industry standard. He's updated it over and over again because, rules change a little bit. What scripts looked like in the 70s, much different than they look like, currently. But that would be my best bet. Try to read as many scripts as you can, and pick up Dave Trottier's Screenwriter's Bible. Dave is not telling me to market for him. He's a great guy, but it's a good start at the very least. What do you consider a marketable script, and when do we know when it's good enough to pitch? So that last half of the question is a big one, because a lot of times we just don't know, and you're going to experience that your whole career, even to a point of, let's say you really do find success, you get a movie that's made, you're sitting in the theater and you're going to watch certain sections of your movie and you're like, oh God, it's awful. You're going to have that experience. You're going to have this feeling of, no matter where you are in the process, it is just isn't quite there yet. You're always going to be questioning that. Just accept it. Nothing wrong with it. It's totally normal. But you do then also need to have a healthy level of detachment. So to directly answer your question as best I can, because it's a tricky one, it's all relative, but you have to know, I've done this much work, meaning I've gone through multiple drafts of this thing by applying multiple levels of notes. So yeah, I've had more than 3 people read it. I've applied the notes that those 3 people have given me. And then I've had more other people read it also and give their notes. And then I'm seeing patterns in terms of the notes, trying to address those patterns. If you feel like you just can't rewrite it again, don't. Pitch it, see how it goes. The one thing that I've noticed, I've been with the ISA for 6 years. I've been working in the screenwriting educational world and the development, screenwriting development world, both business side of things plus education for, I think I guess it's a little over 15 years now. The one thing I've noticed, and I'm including myself in this, is that we as screenwriters become a little too precious with the material that we've written. Meaning, I just wrote this script. It's the greatest fucking thing ever. Pardon my French, but we too easily go there, and we have to, stay humble. There's a good chance that, let's say you write 5 screenplays, 4 of them may never go anywhere. And that's not me trying to be negative. It's not me trying to, be pessimistic and tell anybody to just, in no way am I saying you give up, keep going. But there's a good chance that's going to happen. And we have to just kind of know that, accept that. And in a lot of ways, we don't have control over what happens once we're done writing the script. You're going to get it out into the world. Other people are going to judge the hell out of it. And that's just the sad truth. And it's very relative to the person reading it. We live in, and live and work in a creative industry. And it's hard. And so you have no control once you get the script out there. If you're going to make the movie yourself, or you're going to fund it yourself, you're going to have a lot more control. That's just hard truth. But to know when it's good enough to pitch, you just feel you have this level of confidence that I've really done a lot of work on this. And I don't think I have enough creative energy at this point to continually rewrite it. And so as lame as the answer is, you just kind of get this gut feeling. If you know you haven't done enough, like, well, I'm trying to hide the fact that I've only written 2 drafts, probably not ready to go out. In terms of what do you consider a marketable script? Really tricky, because we can't be writing to trends, because if there's something that's trending now, by the time you finish the script, because you want to try to write to the trend, it may not be a trend anymore. So how do you define what's marketable? I mean, the easiest and most basic answer is it a really high concept, so like a situation we haven't seen before? Emphasis on that word situation. The Purge, or 40-Year-Old Virgin, even. Something that's just a really easy to Liar, Liar with Jim Carrey. This guy is physically unable to tell a lie for 24 hours. Those ideas, if you can come up with something that high concept, you're probably going to find a home for it. Those ideas are also few and far between, because it's tough to come up with a really big idea like that. And by big idea, it doesn't mean it has to be all these different layers. It's easy. It's actually simple, but it's a big idea. That's one way to understand, I think I have something marketable. The other side of it, though, is that that you've put your unique self into it, that I'm trying to say something with this story, and I don't think people have heard this story before. And it doesn't have to be high concept. It doesn't have to be this big idea. Lady Bird was not a high concept movie. It's very low concept, really basic and simple idea in terms of plot and concept, but the characters were very, very layered. The characters were not simple, and the situation that the characters were in from a personal level, not simple. There were a lot of emotional issues going on between Lady Bird and her mom, and then everything else that she was experiencing. And, in terms of Lady Bird's arc, she might have changed by the end. We get a glimpse into, she might have learned her lesson a little bit. Her flaw may have been that she just thought she knew better. By the end of the movie, maybe I didn't know everything, but she's not going to go on this huge arc. So it's pretty low concept, but the writers had something to say. I'm saying Noah Baumbach, I think, is the writer. Or am I completely missing that? But anyway, I think you get where I'm going with this, right? If you have a big idea like The Purge or something big like Liar Liar, great, go for it. You're still going to put your voice in there. What's my take on this? But you don't need the huge high concept. So it's a big question. Hopefully I helped answer that as best I could. Production companies are asking for pitch decks. Who can we as writers partner with to get these created? Graphic designers. Basically, you as the writer, you need to come up with the content. You need to be able to sell your project at a conceptual level. This thing, Archimedes, it's like a baby. Look at this. I have to hold my baby while I'm hosting classes. I did not sign up for that. Anyway, I did sign up for it. So yeah, I mean, you've got to come up with the content. You've got to make sure that the thing has a big hook, that the characters are interesting, that you're delivering, a relatively short pitch deck, pitch Bible. You can choose, try and find the images that look good, but you got to find a graphic designer who's going to be able to make it look professional. Because that's what I did, in the animated TV world. You don't necessarily need to have a pilot written. You don't necessarily need the script if you're writing for kids animation. If you're writing for preschool or 6 to 11 or 11 to 14, if you have a really great idea and an amazing pitch deck, the script doesn't necessarily need to be written. It doesn't hurt if it's written, but you're going to sell the idea. They're going to bring on a showrunner and they're going to put, writers together and come up with the actual screenplays. So then that means even more so, you need to have a really killer pitch deck, pitch Bible, whatever you want to call it. So yeah, who can we as writers partner with? Graphic designers, man. As lame as that answer is, hopefully that helped. I was told once in notes for my fantasy feature that something needed to happen around page 80 in regards to danger, change in tone, conflict. What are your thoughts? So really what's that? It's a big note. And, we have some time here. That's the problem with notes sometimes. And a lot of times you see that when getting notes from executives, people at studios, production companies or something, they never explain the note. So you have to figure out, well, what is that really saying? It's one thing to look at page 80 and then go, all right, I got to change this page. It's a whole other thing to look a little deeper, because if by page 80, the reader isn't feeling that type of conflict and change in tone and danger, then there's probably a lot of places prior to page 80 that need to be affected. What they're also talking about is the end of the second act. By that point, we're getting to the low point. And in my sequential approach of the 12 sequences, and I shouldn't say I'm not the only one that does that through a sequential order of things, but through the 12 sequence approach, sequence 9 is considered your low point. So that means it's marking the end of the second act, and the low point is what it sounds like. It's the lowest point for a main character. And it's the culmination of everything the character has been attempting to achieve, but fails. So we've been spending, the last hour or so with this character, watching that person attempt to achieve something, to accomplish something, to change something, to escape from something or whatever. And then by this point at the end of your second act in a feature, it bottoms out. It doesn't work. The midpoint complication is usually a little bit of an early reference to low point. There's this, or it's early high, kind of depends. But if you look at Harry and Sally, it was kind of the beginning of their low point, right? Everything changed. It was like, oh my God, that was a mistake. We should not have done that. Kind of felt like a little bit of a low point, but they were going to fight it a little bit. They're going to try to be friends still. And then the real low point is the blow up fight at Jess and Marie's wedding. And they're quite literally estranged. There's a physical estrangement between the two. If you look at Star Wars, Obi-Wan literally dies. It's a low point, and it's kind of Luke's fault. And that's in a way, I mean, I'm not going to argue Star Wars theory, but That's usually how it goes for a low point. The main character causes the low point, in more ways than or usually, I guess I will say, not all the time, but usually the low point is brought on by the main character. So that's probably what they're referencing, that the low point didn't feel low enough because there hadn't been enough conflict prior to that moment, or a level of stakes. Why is this so important to your main character? How do we define and show that? What would happen if the character doesn't achieve the goal? And not just from a plot standpoint, but from an emotional one. If Lady Bird was never able to leave home, she would have killed herself. Like that was her emotional reaction. The worst thing that could have happened to her was to never be able to leave home. So we knew that early on. We knew that there was this emotional need for her. She thought it was the most important thing. And so in a way, the low point, page 80, whatever you want to call it, is kind of this I told you so moment for your main character. I knew this bad thing could have happened. It just did. Only the main character is kind of responsible for it. So it's impossible not to learn the lesson. Again, I could go into a whole class just on structure from a logistical standpoint, but it's impossible not to talk about, or it's possible to talk about structure without referencing character stakes and emotions and that character progression of a relationship and all that stuff. So it's all intertwined. So okay, we've got maybe a half hour. More questions if you have any, throw them out. If you would like to work with me one-on-one, I do have some room. You can go to thestoryfarm.org and check me out, or just email me, max@thestoryfarm.org. We can talk about what your needs are. I have a whole bunch of different options. In terms of that third point, and I kind of mentioned it earlier, it's the simplest one, formatting and scene writing, somewhat different, but formatting, again, it should be the easiest thing. Don't take for granted the importance of it, though. If you, it's hard to say, just use Final Draft or Movie Magic Screenwriter or Writer Duet. You can look at writerduet.com. I think it's like $25 a month. It does virtually the same exact thing as Final Draft, and it's all online. You can share. It's called Writer Duet because, let's say you have a writing partner and you're typing away, that person can log in and see you typing. And Final Draft, I think, has that too. But Writer Duet's all online, $25 a month. We have no connection with Writer Duet, so whether you buy it or not, I I don't care. But what I do care about is just a proper format, man. You've got to understand how scene headings work. You have to study and read scripts and see how other people are working through the scene direction. Don't make any spelling mistakes. It's so obvious. And I've read so many screenplays. All of our team members with the ISA, we are constantly reading screenplays. And it's a bummer for us, honestly, when we open a script and it's like, oh my God, it's 143 pages long. There's this dense scene direction, just thick paragraphs of over description, or we've got these intensely long pieces of monologue, and there's spelling goofs. We don't want to read it, and that's not us being harsh, but you have to also kind of take into account how everybody in town, they're reading this like all the time. They're reading screenplays, and it kind of has evolved, obviously, over the past 100 years. To the point of where people actually don't like reading because more often than not, the scripts that come through just haven't been worked on enough. So you really just take the time to look at screenwriting software. One question, do you have any examples of successful scripts with more than one main character? Off the top of my head, I mean, I don't know why I'm going to this, but The Big Chill, any ensemble, The Big Chill is just so old. I shouldn't say so old, but we want to try to find something current. Basically any TV script. I mean, you're going to have multiple storylines in a TV show. Study how that's done. What are the beats? When do we move to storyline B? Who is the main character of that storyline? Half-hour comedy usually has ensembles. Basically any ensemble. The Family Stone is like a kind of Thanksgiving holiday movie with Sarah Jessica Parker and Luke Wilson. They all, the only difference is that, well, Love Actually is another example of you don't have one main character. I hesitate. Well, be careful when writing a screenplay where you think I have multiple main characters, because you technically have a lot more work to do. Because if you look at Love Actually, those are like it's like 5 different movies in one movie. You have to work out all of those storylines completely separately, meaning here's Hugh Grant's storyline. This is what he does. This is what his conflict is. This is what he wants. Here's a secondary character that's going through this. And then, we have Alan Rickman's storyline. This is what he does. This is what they do. This is, and God, my brain is not working in terms of remembering actor names. But you have more work to do and technically a lot less time to get all that out. And so if you haven't spent the time really doing the work on your project to make sure that, okay, if I'm doing a true ensemble, all of these storylines need to follow the same structural beat that even just a one main character story would. But I have that much less time to do it. Colin Firth's story, where he's the writer and he goes to Spain and he has the assistant that he ends up falling in love with. So these are all separate stories that kind of intertwine, not kind of, but they literally intertwine by the end. It's a lot of work to do. So don't take it lightly. I don't mean to be harsh, but okay, so I won't be. I won't be harsh. Do the work if you have an ensemble and really study these other movies that have done it well, and just pay attention. If you have 4 main characters, they all have their own flaws. They all have their own goals, desires, reasons for wanting something, stakes involved, their own storylines. And that's why TV has done so well over the past few years, because we can spend time with all of these characters. We go through these multiple storylines, they come together, they go apart, but we're able to spend time with these people. As opposed to a movie, you got maybe 2 hours, Let's see. So back to formatting, scene writing. I think, and this may just be my personal preference, but in terms of maybe this will be the last must-have that we talk about. Scene writing is really just another term for crafting a really good scene, understanding how the beats of a scene work. What's the point of this particular scene? What is this character trying to achieve? Who wins the scene? Is there an argument? Who's going to overcome that argument? Maybe nobody does. What's the point of this scene? And I have to understand that, you as the writer. But then also, dialogue, obviously, is an incredibly important part of a screenplay. But what we tend to do, and what I notice a lot, is that the writers fall in love with their dialogue a little more than they need to. And then the dialogue becomes informational, and they're speaking directly to, here's what you need to know, Mr. or Ms. Audience. And the audience doesn't necessarily want or expect that. The audience wants to participate in the viewing of this movie or show. We want to, as an audience, experience visual storytelling. Let me see something and then come up with my own idea as to what it means, as opposed to always hear the character saying, here's what it means. So in a way, this is commentary on the nose dialogue. One little test that I give my writers, and not necessarily forcing them to do this literally, but to at least come from this thought process of, if I was forced to write this scene that has a ton of dialogue without any dialogue, can I get the same information across? Can I say the same thing without saying it literally? And a really good example is this movie, 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri, with Frances McDormand. And if you haven't seen it, you should see it. Really well-written movie, not an easy one to watch, because it isn't like it's this happy ending kind of movie, but really well done, I will say. And there's a moment in terms of character definition that it's kind of, I think it's in the first act, where she is in the office of the sign person, meaning the company that is leasing the signs that she is using to broadcast the fact that she's very upset with the police department. Something's come up. I'm not going to go into the whole story, but she's incredibly angry at this poor guy sitting on the other side of this desk. And I'm putting that lightly. Like, she is acting like a monster to this poor guy. saying horrible things, screaming, just being terrible. After she's done screaming, she walks over to the windowsill in the same room, and there's a beetle that's been flipped over on its back, and its legs are kind of, it's trying to turn itself back over. And she walks over to it, looks at it, and lightly and delicately picks it up, turns it over, and allows it to continue walking. That right there, that visual tells us, the audience, that she actually isn't a monster. She could have just smushed the bug, and that would have told us something different. But, we just saw her acting horrible and saying terrible things to this poor guy. And then she walks over and doesn't kill the bug. So it says a lot of things. It says she may care about other creatures more than she does humans, but it also says that she probably isn't as bad as she's making herself out to be. She's probably going to be making some bad decisions, which she really does. And she probably lets her anger overcome her, but she can maybe manage it. It says so many things without literally saying something. And I always, there was a hard lesson for me to learn, but anytime I'm approaching a scene that I'm writing, I try to come from that level first. What do the visuals tell the reader? And can the dialogue just comment on the visuals? It's a kind of gross exaggeration, but dialogue should be used as a way for subtext. Yes, of course, information. There are some movies that you need to get broad exposition out, but you have to do it lightly. And you don't want to overstate things, even in the scene direction. We're not writing a book. We have to be pretty specific. We don't have to be grammatically correct. You can write sentence fragments. You can use hyphens and ellipses and all, as long as just the experience is good and positive and engaging and entertaining. But there are other levels of formatting I can get into. You want to be careful with usage of parentheticals, where you have the character name, and then below it there's the little parentheses where you say awkwardly, or just awkwardly, or overzealous, or whatever. You're trying to express the emotion that the character is then using in terms of while saying the line. Just try not to use them would be my overall advice. Of course, you can use it every now and then, but I see it a lot where the writer's trying to make sure the reader's getting this. Here's exactly what I'm trying to say. But if you were to read the script Lady Bird, it's a little different because Greta Gerwig knew she was going to direct it, so she could kind of write the script however. But it's a good example of how light a script can look. Like, there was very little description for anything in that script. And so it's a good example of how little you can put into it, and yet the script is still delivering. So just, have a balance there. We don't want to overuse parentheticals. We don't want to overuse exclamation points. We don't necessarily need to always capitalize things or put things in italics, or, just let the script breathe, come from a place of visual storytelling. Let's see, another question. We're going to do probably another at least 15 minutes here. So if you have more questions, throw them out. Thoughts on stories where the main character doesn't have a specific goal. For example, Elizabeth in Pride and Prejudice. So my argument is that there is usually some kind of goal. And if it's not obvious, then it's an emotional one. There's an emotional desire of some kind. And then it's okay. Like Lady Bird didn't really have a plot goal. She just knew she needed something different. I can't live the way I'm living, so there's an emotional goal there that then propels her to make decisions. Otherwise, if there was literally no true goal, or truly no goal, what's the character doing? So they're doing something. There's some level of conflict. And so I would just try to differentiate the word. What do you mean by that? A plot goal? That's fine. There doesn't need to be this defined. What did Forrest Gump want as a goal? I mean, technically, we've come to find that his goal was just to get to Jenny's house because he wanted to see her. It's a really basic goal. But really, it was just a story for the audience to learn something, So if by way of my experiencing Elizabeth in Pride and Prejudice teaches me something, great, the story did something. Like, it worked. Whether it's a huge plot goal of find the treasure, or Escape New York, or, what, don't die in the zombie apocalypse. We don't need those huge high concept goals. As long as we understand a level of emotional intent, the character finds something that is really important to him or her, and here's why it's important. But that level of importance is also trying to teach us something, or give the audience an experience of, what are we trying to say as a writer, I think, is the biggest question there. And if we need a big goal, like, find the treasure, great. If you don't, and it's just Lady Bird who just wanted to get away from her parents, there wasn't this defined plot goal at the end of it. I hope that helped. If you have any other questions, feel free to throw them out. Let me make sure I'm not forgetting anything. Let's see here. I covered most of the topics here. Yeah. So I think, all of what I talked about was really more than just three things. My title was 3 crucial characteristics that your script must have. The most important characteristic, and this should go without saying, is just an emotional experience, whatever that emotional experience is. And emotion is usually provided by way of seeing a character overcome something, whether it's internal, external, someone else, literally another person, or just herself, or whatever it is. We have to understand why the emotion is occurring. We have to have a level of empathy for this character, and not necessarily I feel bad for that person, but we understand where this person is coming from. Why are they making these decisions? What do they believe in? What's at stake? So all of that has to do with emotional reaction. We need to provide some level of conflict, whether it's literal and external, like a zombie movie, but even in zombie stories, you have this other internal thing going on, So I think that kind of wraps it up. I'm going a little, I guess, not too short, but I hope that helps everybody. I mean, just the best thing you can do is churn out as many scripts as you can. There was a question earlier, how do you know when a script's marketable? And I remember I overheard, and this is my cat now downstairs playing with the recycling bin, if you can hear the jingling of bottles, but the joys of doing classes from home. But I remember when this was years ago, and there was a producer that I was friends with, and he was talking to someone who had just moved to Hollywood, and that person was, attempting to be a screenwriter, or her intent was to be a screenwriter. And I was listening because I was just really curious what he was going to say. So I was obviously eavesdropping. And I can't remember the exact context in terms of how what he said came up, but he said, you're not a screenwriter until you write 10 screenplays. And my initial response to that, at least, internally, was, fuck you, man. Like, I was actually angry for this poor person who this guy was saying this to. Because that isn't true, but I understand what he's saying, and it is actually good advice if you get past the ego reaction, because what he's saying is that it takes some time for you to understand your own writing, your own voice. What am I trying to say? What's my style? Do I really understand how a screenplay is written? Have I done enough work and research? So oddly enough, it's actually really good advice. Write as many scripts as you possibly can, even if 6 of them are awful. Just get into that process, get into this level of knowing that I can do this. The more scripts you finish, the better you feel, because you've finished a screenplay. How good does it feel every time you finish a script, but it also keeps you from relying on, putting all your eggs in one basket kind of metaphor. Because it takes a long time to get your career going. Anytime you hear about some kind of overnight success, and I'm using my air quotes, it's just not overnight. Like, these people have been working so hard to get to this place, and then suddenly it hits, and now it feels like they're an overnight success because nobody's heard of them. But it doesn't necessarily work that way. The likelihood of writing one screenplay, selling it for, a 6-figure sum, getting the movie made, pretty low. That's just the reality of it. it can happen, but we shouldn't be striving for that. We should be striving for a level of having an understanding of our own craft and ability, and doing this because it's fun and important. We have stories to tell. These themes and messages and the stories I want to tell are important. I want people to know this because maybe it's a story that people don't know. And there's a reason that I need to share it because people can learn, those are much more important reasons to be pursuing this. Not just to sell one script and go. This isn't the stock market, even though it feels like we're playing the lottery sometimes. All right, so I think that's about it. We need a film about the cat from Archimedes' point of view. He has multiple points of view. I've known a lot of cats in my life, and this thing, I've never known one that talks as much as he does. He's downstairs right now, just playing and talking to himself. Honestly, I've never met a cat like this. Poor guy was maybe 5 months old. I have a loft, and he went chasing a ball and jumped over the edge of my loft and probably 15 feet up, and he broke his leg, and I had to get it amputated. And it was awful. Like, it was a week into after I just adopted him, and oh God, I felt like the worst human being on the planet, and I'm a terrible cat dad, all these things. He's just like, whatever. He knows no difference. I do, it still kills me looking at him. But yeah, he has quite the personality, man. I don't know if we need a film, but it would be interesting and fun to see that from his perspective. All right, everybody. I think that's about it. I mean, if you wanted to inquire about even just the ISA, what is it? How can I be a part of it? You can email me. But if you want to, I have 2 email addresses. How about this? So Max at is the beginning of both. So Max at networkisa.org. If you have questions about the ISA, what is it? How can I be involved? Or you just go to the website, networkisa.org. But if you want to inquire about working with me one-on-one, you could go to thestoryfarm.org or email me at max@thestoryfarm.org. All right. So let's see. I think we've got another comment. It's true that literally no one is an overnight success, and that the reason to pursue storytelling is for the fulfillment of the act in itself. It's the fulfillment of also, in a selfish way, to reveal ourselves to people. Even though it's kind of scary sometimes, we put ourselves into these stories, and sometimes we have a need to just kind of, here's a little piece of who I am, and I want people to know that. Or here's something that happened to me that I think other people can relate to. There's nothing wrong with taking a little bit of a selfish approach there. We're not all perfectly selfish in that way. So have fun with it. Otherwise, if it's not fun, man, you're going to have to do something else because it's hard. It's really hard. All right. Archie says goodbye. And I appreciate all the time. And thank you to Imagine This for having me. And, it's been fun. Keep working hard, everybody. And, we're looking forward